Hi, I'm Peter Giles, a Jesuit priest and the director of A Faith That Does Justice. I'd like to take a moment to continue our weekly reflections. This week we really speak in the Christian tradition on the fourth week in ordinary time. And these readings really speak to the prophetic voice. In our first reading, we hear Moses talking to the Jewish people about prophets who would follow after him. And in our gospel reading from Mark, we hear Jesus, who, at least from the Christian perspective, would be the final of the Jewish prophets. So I'll begin by talking just briefly about the scriptures themselves. The book of Deuteronomy really has Moses now, as I mentioned, speaking to the Jewish people, exhorting them, challenging them to live covenant relationship, to move beyond their sinfulness, and to live as God would have them live. He's writing or speaking roughly 1,500 years before Jesus walked upon this earth. And interesting, what he really says too is, woe to the person, the people, the prophets, who lead the people astray. He said, surely they will die at God's hands. A powerful message he's saying about really the lying, the untruth within society. In our gospel reading, we hear a very interesting story where Jesus has recently been baptized in the River Jordan. He has gone back up to Galilee among people of his own kin, people where he was raised. Today we find him in Capernaum, a town north of Nazareth where he would have grown up. And he's in a synagogue on the Sabbath, and a man possessed by a demon approaches him and really speaks out to him. We know who you are, Jesus of Nazareth. In biblical tradition, to mention someone's name is to own them, to be powerful, to have power over them. And what we hear is Jesus' response, saying, stop, come out of him. It's very clear that Jesus is speaking prophetically with the sense that God is upon him, God's Spirit rests upon him, and that the demon does not have control. Jesus has control over the demons. People are amazed at what he's saying, and they're amazed too at his courage to speak truth to power. Jesus' desire is that people have life in its fullness, and that man-made laws of the Sabbath are not intended to impede that. And that is what we're seeing play out today. If I speak second then about the prophetic voice, I've mentioned this to people when I've spoken before, that perhaps 50 or 60 years ago now, Abraham Heschel, a Jewish rabbi, social activist in the 60s, really wrote about the Jewish prophets. And it's a landmark book because his insight into it moved beyond the idea that prophets not only spoke truth to power, spoke truth in the present, challenging people to live as God would have them live, but they each spoke with their own personality, what he calls a pathos, or an emotional response to the social situations in which they were commenting on. And what we find is that for the most part, there were three basic emotions. The first was a tremendous sense of sorrow and hurt, as if God saying to the people, how could you treat me this way after all I've done for you? I've taken you from the land of Egypt. I've led you to a land flowing in milk and honey, where you could thrive, and look at the way you're treating others now. The widow, the orphan, the poor, demeaning them, taking advantage of them. And what Heschel will say is that shortly thereafter, God's sorrow is expressed, emerges a seething rage where God says, how dare you? And now you will suffer for what you've done to my people. But what we find is that the people do suffer, but that with time, God's emotion moves to a sense of great compassion and love for the people God had chosen. And the story really tells us is that God's anger endures in history but a moment, and that God's love endures forever. And so we find God forgives over and over again the Jewish people, offering them another chance to return to covenant relationship. So we might ask ourselves today, what does the prophetic voice mean to us today? Is it gone? Is it something that happened many years ago? And I would say no. The biblical expression of that, as I mentioned, began with Moses and from a Christian perspective ended with Jesus. But prophetic voices arise in society from time to time. People who have the courage to speak God's truth to society, challenging them to live as God would have them live. And what does it mean for us today? We live in a society right now where we have experienced over the past several years lying at the structural level at levels we have never seen before. Manipulation of people of goodwill to do evil. And what we experienced more recently is the insurrection that took place at our capital. Horrible, horrible things have occurred. And I can only be reminded of what Moses said, "Woe to the false prophet. They will surely die at God's hands." And so I think what it really tells us today is to be attentive to the prophetic voice. God's voice speaking through people to us in history, or perhaps God asking us to speak to others on behalf of God. Challenging people to live as God would have us live, to live covenant relationship with God so that all God's people might have a fair chance at living as God would have them and really attaining the self-fulfillment in life that God desires for us all. As Christians, we can go even a further step. I think we're called to follow Jesus in this world, living as he did, a prophet who asks us to follow after him and to live the prophetic voice. To do so is more than just going to church on Sunday. It's also more than identifying with Jesus' life and his values of love, compassion, and justice for all God's people. It also requires the courage to place ourselves in social settings of injustice, and once there, to act against human sinfulness, speaking truth to power on behalf of people who are being hurt and on behalf of God who desires that all people have a fair chance to really reach the ultimate potential that God would have for them. It's a daunting challenge, but it is the challenge we face as Christians, and it comes with the trust, or our own trust, that if we follow Jesus with this type of fidelity, we will one day live with him in the kingdom of God he preached, a world where there is love for all God's people, where there is compassion at the sight of human suffering, and where God's justice reaches out not just to some, but for all God's people. So I hope this brief reflection is helpful. And I look forward weekly to continuing what we're doing to try and give some food for thought as we enter into our weekend and perhaps our liturgical services in the different churches we attend. So thank you very much, and I'll look forward to speaking with you again next week. Have a great week. Be safe. Be well in this time of COVID. Thank you so much. Bye now.